Well, good day there. This is Joe Van Cleve, and welcome to another episode of the Typewriter video series. Today, I would like to talk about the similarities between film photography and typewritten documents and film and manual typewriters. So stay tuned. I believe it was last week when I was at a local thrift store here in Albuquerque, and I happened across this found photograph. And what I liked about this photograph, first of all, was the composition. I like the two men in the fedora hats and the suits. I like the way their posture is and just the composition of the light in the dark parts of the area and the contrast between the rounded curves of the automobile and the angular corners of the staircase in the lower right corner. But it's an interesting print because it's kind of enigmatic. We don't know where it was taken. We don't know who the people are. And yet the only document we have of its survival is this physical print that's in less than pristine condition. And what it reminded me of was the idea that we don't really know what camera took this picture. It's probably a folding medium format camera, and it appears to be a contact print. We don't have the film negative, so we don't have the original file, if you will. All we have is this surviving print. And it's survived for probably 70 or 80 years, perhaps, in pretty good shape. Now, the back side of the print has this yellowish stain that looks like it was once cemented into a photo album with rubber cement. But besides that, that's about all we know about it. And the thing that struck me that day was it was the same thrift store and the same time that I bought the blue electric Smith Corona typewriter. I don't have it on display here because this is the Olympia SF, and I was using it today at the local cigar store and carrying it in my little messenger bag, but this is our display typewriter. But I bought that other typewriter at the same time I bought this print. And the parallels between film cameras, film photography, typewritten documents, and typewriters is kind of interesting. One of those similarities between these two is the fact that they reside principally in physical media. In the case of the print, it's a silver gelatin print. It's light-sensitive silver gelatin coated on a piece of paper. And that's the only surviving record of this image. Likewise, if I take a piece of paper such as a typewritten sheet, it is a physical piece of paper with ink imprinted upon it, very similar conceptually to the photographic print. Likewise, the entire film process of using a mechanical film camera to expose film in the process of developing the film, it's physical and chemical, just like the mechanical imprints that a typewriter does onto paper using an inked ribbon. So there's this idea that these devices create physical media. In the case of, for instance, a digital camera, if we had digital cameras as far back as, let's say, the 1940s or 50s, just imagining this, what format would the digital file reside in? Would it be some kind of a floppy disk, and maybe back then it would have been some kind of a reel of magnetic tape, almost like a reel-to-reel? You'd have a roll of tape, and maybe it would be in a cartridge format later on. So you'd have a JPEG image or an equivalent kind of a file on a magnetic media. How long is that going to reside? Well, it's questionable whether magnetic media will last very long, and you basically have to recopy it periodically to ensure it survives. But more importantly, though, the similarities between typewritten and even handwritten documents and photographs is that they are accessible without any special technology. And I think this is one of the most important aspects to both typewritten documents and prints, photographic prints. You can view a photographic print without a special disc reader, card reader, without a special form of technology. The information is visually evident directly on the print itself by human vision, and the same thing is true with typewritten documents. The information is directly accessible as long as you can understand the language. You don't need a Rosetta Stone. As long as you can understand it and translate it, the information is evident right there. There's another parallel between these two forms of media, and that is, if I wanted to convert this print into some kind of a digital file, I could either photograph it with a camera, a digital camera, or I could scan it with a scanner. And either way, I could convert it back into a JPEG file, which actually I've done on this picture. I have made a fairly low quality scan and put it on my Flickr and put it on a blog article that I wrote this week. And the same thing is true with the typewritten document. Typewritten documents, you can transcribe them by hand via keyboard into a word processing device. You can scan them as a JPEG file and post them as a typecast. You can use OCR, optical character recognition software, on a document like this and also convert it into a electronic text file. So they both are readily accessible via human vision without any special technology, and they're both convertible into digital formats with some kind of a reasonably simple process. You know, I was thinking about old digital media like 8-inch floppies and 5 1/4-inch floppy disks, and there are some people out there that have those disks still around, and even if the magnetic signals recorded on them were still viable, it's questionable whether anybody would have a drive that's working that would read it, and whether that drive would be able to interface to a computer to be able to use the drive. So there's a lot of interesting questions when it comes to archivability of data. And we don't really think of data when we think of photographs, but the photographs are data, and typewritten documents are data, but they start out in a physical form. One of the photography discussion forums that I tend to frequent is Rangefinder Forum. And there was a recent thread on Rangefinder Forum about what are all of the newly manufactured film cameras still being made. And I think there is some Nikon, like an FM10 or something, and there is, of course, the Leica M7 and MP that's still being made as new film cameras. I believe Fujifilm had a medium format folder that was manufactured up until the last couple years, but there's only a handful of newly made film cameras still on the market. There are a handful of black and white and color films still available. There has been a little mini resurgence of use of film, just like there's been a resurgence of interest in manual typewriters. But I would say the main difference between what you might call a film renaissance and a typewriter renaissance is that in the case of manual typewriters, and ignoring the very low quality Asian manufactured typewriters of recent vintage, for all intents and purposes, typewriters are a dead medium in the sense of they're no longer being made. There are a finite number of typewriters out in the world. They're in people's private collections. They are being used often by us typewriter aficionados. They're being fixed up by us typewriter aficionados and by the few surviving typewriter repair shops. There are a lot of typewriters laying in people's basements and attics. There are a lot of junky typewriters that are totally broken and serve no other purpose except either as decor or as source of spare parts. And so the question that kind of comes to my mind, since we talked about old technology and old media like old film prints and old typewritten documents, the question is this media survivable into the future? And specifically, are these machines survivable into the future? And I'd like to think that there has been a lot of good progress made recently in the typewriter community toward keeping these machines survivable, especially the work of Richard Polt and Ted Monk, who has worked recently to produce a whole series of service manuals for various typewriter brands, the typewriter repair Bibles that he's selling. And those are great sources of legacy service literature. Now, another question, though, comes to mind as far as keeping the fleet of finite typewriters in the world running into the indeterminate future is going to be the issue of spare parts. Now, a lot of typewriter repair shops that have been in business for a long time do have a supply of broken machines that they do use for repairing other machines as a source of spare parts. But those supplies of broken typewriters are finite. You only have so many of those left. And so the question is, can we use new manufacturing methods like the so-called 3D printing manufacturing to create new parts? Well, I think in terms of things like keycaps and platen knobs, things that are made of plastic, it's probably, and in fact it's being done right now. People are 3D printing those kind of parts. And then the rubber parts like platens are being re-sleeved. There's a few people that are selling replacement rubber feet for some of the older typewriters. So those are being sourced now as new replacement parts. But I think a lot of the critical parts in machines are going to be the high tensile strength steel parts that were either milled or they were stamped. And those are not easily 3D printable in the sense of a conventional 3D printer that uses thermal extrusion of plastic. I can see that perhaps we can 3D model these mechanical parts using some kind of 3D scanning technology, make a digital file, and then have a machine shop machine those out, mill them out from a blank of high tensile strength metal. That's probably the only way we have going into the future of getting metal parts, or using 3D technology to create plastic molds and having them cast, having these parts cast. But oftentimes with these mechanical typewriters, it's a question of metallurgy, because not all of the metals in a typewriter have the same tensile strength or the same physical properties. Some of the metals in these typewriters need a lot more tensile strength. Other parts need to be a lot less brittle. And so it's the whole question of metallurgy, and it's not as simple as simply saying we can 3D print something like that. So going into the future, it's a real question as to whether we're going to have replacement parts for these typewriters, and that's a big difference between them and film cameras, for instance. And in the case of film cameras, if worse comes to worse, it's not that difficult for a person to make a 4x5 view camera. I've basically done it. And anybody that can make plywood, turn plywood into a box and can make a homemade bellows or whatever, you can put a large format lens shutter on the front of it and put a film holder in the back and have a camera. So in the sense of homemade cameras, they're going to continue into the future as long as we have 4x5 film and paper. But a homemade typewriter? I don't think so. And we have a finite number of these machines left in the world. What are you going to do with yours? So this comes down to the question of, if you are a typewriter collector like I am, and I have a finite collection of typewriters. I have 16 or 17, and I really can't get any more in my house, practically speaking, and still have domestic tranquility. And that's probably true with most of you out there, is you have a limited room and budget in your life for typewriters. So what are you going to do with your collection as the selection of used typewriters will eventually dry up? And of course that begs the question of, is that true? Will the supply of typewriters, used typewriters out on the market, dry up? Will there be enough of a revival of typewriter interest that all the collectors out there snap up every used machine that's any good, and a lot of them that are junky, all the rusted ones in people's barns and backyards and sheds? And if so, does that imply that eventually there's not going to be any more typewriters out there? You're not going to be able to go down to a thrift store or Goodwill or an antique store or Craigslist or whatever and easily find a used typewriter anymore? Well, that's a good question. Even now on the Antique Typewriter Facebook group, I see people commenting that it's getting harder and harder for them to find typewriters in their local community at thrift stores. And so it's an interesting question. What are you going to do as a collector when the supply of typewriters dries up? And for me, what I've been doing is, because my ability to collect typewriters is limited, And I know that's limited. I can't just keep collecting them. That means that I end up passing on a lot of typewriters that I see in thrift stores simply because they're not good enough. They're average, middle of the road, okay, not great condition, but nothing special. And so I'm at the point in my typewriter collecting where I'm really looking for special things. Things that are really appeal to me, like this little late 1950s little German-made portable Olympia SF. Beautiful little machine, beautifully made, durable, has a great typing action, and really not that noisy, pretty quiet, right? Or the turquoise blue Smith Corona Electric. Oh, gosh, what a find that was. That's one of those typewriters that you can't pass up. So that's kind of what I've been doing in my collecting, is I have been prioritizing my collection toward machines that I really like. Good high-quality portables and more medium-sized portables that have a great typing action or great feel to them, and that appeal to me in that way. And the most important thing about them, about all my typewriter collecting really, is that they have to be functional. Because I don't collect typewriters to use as decoration, even though I have one or two machines out somewhere in the house serving as decor. But all of my machines that I collect have to be functional and have to be an enjoyable typing experience. No, not all of them are equal. You can't expect a small little portable to be quite as good as a Hermes 3000, for instance, or a larger Olympia, but every one of them must have some attribute about it that I really enjoy using, because going in the future, I expect it'll be harder and harder to find these machines, and I think there will be a day when I hope we'll just continue to have new typewriter ribbons, and we'll have a fixed number of machines in our possession, and we'll enjoy them. And so those are my thoughts about this parallel between old cameras, old prints, old typewritten documents, and old typewriters. They're what you might call dead media, in the sense, compared to the world of contemporary culture. They are dead media, but we find there's still practical uses for these machines and this kind of media in our lives, and we try to keep them in a usable, serviceable condition so we can be blessed by their presence in our lives. Well, this is Joe Van Cleve with some kind of photographic / typewriter parallels for you collectors out there. And until next time, have yourselves a great day.